Well, welcome to the Best Business Book series. And right now in this particular review, I want to share with you one of my all-time favorite books. The book was called How Will You Measure Your Life? It's from Clayton Christensen. The book was also co-authored by James Allworth and Karen Dillon. A phenomenal book. And in this series, I'm trying to do my best to pull out what are my all-time favorites. There are so many books that come out in the business world, probably, I don't know what the number is, but 50,000 plus every year. Which are the ones that are enduring, that provide value? This particular book, I first read it about a decade ago. I started off with a hardcover edition. I bought the Audible version because I like listening to it. And then after that, I actually did get the Kindle edition. And now what I do is I don't read the whole book again. I probably read or listened to the book 5 times since I originally got it 10 years ago. But about once a year, I'll go back through the highlighted sections that I have on my Kindle. You can pull up that view that just has it. And there's always something fresh that it sparks for me. And in this particular book, first of all, Professor Christensen is best known. He's a Harvard professor, but he also is someone who's actually successfully run a company before, which I respect quite a bit. And what he does, he and his co-authors share about a dozen different theories of running a company that also apply to your life as an individual, but I liked it best for me as a business owner. And one of the things it talks in there about is how can you take these best theories and apply them in your company. And so I'm going to share with you 2 or 3 of the theories or 2 or 3 of the sections that most spoke to me out of the dozen. Again, you might find a different section most impacts you. So the first was they had a section in here called what would have to prove true. It was in the section of strategy. And in this particular section of strategy, they had this distinction called an emergent strategy versus a deliberate strategy. And it makes sense intuitively, right? Sometimes we know what the right answer is. And we know what the right answer is, and we're high confidence, and there's reason for that confidence. Going after that one strategy makes sense. But if we're not sure what the right strategy is, we're going to try a lot of small little tests and quickly find out information. And from these small tests, these small micro bets that we place, we're going to learn enough that the right strategy starts to emerge, becomes obvious. When you start a company, how many times have you seen an early startup where it said, oh, this is what the company is? And then 4 or 5, 6, 7 years later, the company is wholly different than what it originally started with. I know for my company, we originally started in one area, and then what we did, that first area was way too broad. We niched it down. And so now for well over a decade, we've focused on how can we help business owners build companies that they fall in love with again? How can you help a business owner build a business, not just a job? And we focus on that $1 to $50 million a year revenue company that's primarily owner run, or the owner plays a key role in that. Not a company that's got full professional management where the owner is completely passive. That's just not our market. And once upon a time, we did do that. And we also did work with startups, but we don't do that anymore. We're really careful on that niche. But he asked a question in this book, and the question was quite brilliant. It wasn't his question, and I know I'm using the word his, even though he has 2 co-authors. And so I just want to make sure I give credit for James and Karen there, right? Karen Dillon, who I had a wonderful conversation with, interviewing her for an .com article I was writing, former editor of Harvard Business Review, exceptionally articulate, bright woman, incredible journalist and writer. James Allworth, I want to give credit for everyone, but I'm just going to simplify it and use Professor Christensen or Clayton here for that part. And he summarized the work from 2 other academics, and in the book he'll go through all the right references. But he asked this question. He says, when we come up with a strategy, right, we come up with something we think is going to work. Before we rush off to go implement it, we need to ask one more question. And this one more question has saved me and my clients millions of dollars of dead-end strategies. And the question says, quote, what would have to prove true in order for the strategy to work? What would have to prove true? And just by pausing, look, it only takes you 5 to 15 minutes to just stop and ask the question. So let's say you come up with a brilliant strategy. We're going to focus in on this market opportunity, or we're going to develop this new product or service offering, or we're going to go into this new niche. Before we rush off and go do it, we just stop and ask the question, what would have to prove true for this strategy to actually work? The big stuff. And then we ask ourselves, what would we have to pay attention to right? What would have to pay attention to see if that assumption actually was true? I don't know if you're like me or not, but in the past, I have gotten in trouble. I've come up with what I thought was the right strategy, and I forgot that it was actually a bet that I was playing. I really love the idea of thinking now that I'm not actually right or wrong, but I have odds of being right or wrong, that I'm placing all kinds of bets in my company. And sometimes I think we go all in on a strategy without asking the question, what would have to prove true for this to work, and seeing it, are those rational assumptions? Are those assumptions accurate? And if I think they're accurate, how can I pay attention to the actual data as I implement it so that if it is working, wonderful, I double down on it. But if it's not working and I'm paying attention to it, I can cut it off and stop it before it takes the whole company down. A great example, I was talking, like I mentioned before, with his co-author, Karen. And as I was talking with Karen Dillon, she gave the example of Euro Disney. And when Euro Disney launched, they discovered that they had made an assumption that just was not true. They had made the assumption that in France, people in Europe would go to Euro Disney and spend a certain number of days at the amusement park. You know, at Disney World and Disneyland in the United States, people will spend a certain number of days on average. You don't go just for one day on average, they go for multiple days. But what they forgot was that in Euro Disney, when they started off, they didn't have the density of rides. They didn't have the variety, so people got bored after a while and go do other things in Paris there. And so that assumption cost them hundreds of millions of dollars because they'd never asked the question, what would have to prove true for the strategy to work? Namely, in their case, that people would have to go for 3 days on average or whatever the number was. And how could they pay attention to it? Well, if they just stopped and asked that question, they could have very easily been measuring along the lines and saying, you know what? We're only finding people are staying an average of 1 day or 1.25 days, and that would have showed them that all their other pro forma numbers just didn't make sense. So that's the first thing I took from this book. I've used it with clients that before they make a key hire and they're thinking, is this key hire going to work out? They say, what would have to prove true in order for this key hire to work out? Before they go into a new market, what would have to prove true in order for this new strategy in this marketplace to actually be successful? And then they can ask the second follow-on question, how could we measure that? What would we have to pay attention to actually see if that assumption was proving true? The second theory that I loved that he had in his book, he called it the theory of jobs. And again, some of this is work that he didn't create, but he really helped to express or share. He's probably best known for what he calls the innovator's dilemma. Many of you probably have heard of that book. It's a classic now about why people in certain industries, the industry leaders often are not the ones to disrupt and change the industry. There's a reason why Apple was the one to disrupt music industry versus the people in the music industries themselves. People in the industry have so much at stake, so much of a sunk cost that it's very difficult for them to either see or to emotionally allow themselves to see that everything that they've invested in the past might have to be scrapped to make something new and brilliantly different, disruptive. But this theory of jobs basically said, when we look at providing our product or service, we think it's something, like for example, I'll just share from my company. There was a point in time when I thought, our business coaching program, right? I'll abbreviate that here and kind of give an example. Our business coaching program. You would have asked me and said, David, what does your business coaching program do? And I would have said, it provides one-to-one coaching for a client so that every 2 weeks they're talking with an experienced mentor. It provides quarterly live event training so that 2 days every quarter our business owner clients step away from their company for a day and a half of advanced training and a half-day strategic planning. It also is the small group coaching opportunities we have. Our business coaching program also is the online apps that we have that help them do their action plan and their big rock reports to make sure that weekly they're being accountable. And the list would have gone down of all these features of what it offers. But the theory of jobs basically says, hey, nobody hires your product or service to give it like these features. Instead, they hire it to do a job. And by asking the question, what's the job that your customers have hired your service or hired your product to produce, it changes and refines what we actually are trying to fulfill on. So when I think about our business coaching program, it's pretty straightforward. What are our clients wanting from us? They're really hiring our coaching program to give them a business that they love owning again. Most of our clients love their company for the first year or two. And then 5 years in, 10 years in, 15 years in, they might be making more money than they ever did, but boy, they were frustrated. It's become more of a job for them. And what they've hired us to do is not just to provide one-to-one coaching. They haven't hired us just for the advanced workshops. They would like to skip all of that. What they really want is a business they love owning again. That's what they really want. And when we can focus on that this is what they've hired us to do, now we change the service experience. Now we change the product experience to deliver on that core job that it's been hired for. And he gives some examples in the book of how that would work out. He gives some from fast food and some other places. But that was a breakthrough for me, this idea that, hey, people aren't wanting the coaching. What they're really wanting is a business they love owning again. And when I can recognize that, it changes how I deliver it. The final theory he did, and this was one that really impacted me more emotionally. The others were things that mechanically changed how I ran the business. They gave me a better operational way of doing that. But he said something in the book, this final piece that he was talking about, shared a story about a guy he went to get his, this was at Harvard Business School. I'm assuming it was part of the master's program, the MBA program, although he's gone on for his PhD. But he was in this MBA program, and he talked about all the brilliant people he met there. But there was one guy that everyone was sure was going to be a huge success. And this particular guy built a company, and he was a huge success, built a multi-billion-dollar company, Fortune 50, amazing company. And the guy's name was Kenneth Lay. And many of you will recognize the name because he was one of the people involved with Enron. And he talked about no one sets out to basically screw over a whole constituency in the world. No one does that unless they're a sociopath. And Ken Lay wasn't that. And how did he lose his way? Because no one sets out to do that. His comment was that in certain things about principle and behaviors, 100% is easier and more important to do than 99%. It's that when we make those small exceptions, well, this time I'll cut this corner, it becomes easier to go down that slippery slope. He shared it with the Ken Lay example. He shared it with him in his book about how for him, for religious reasons, he didn't play sports on the Sabbath, for him, which was on a Sunday. For me, I'm Jewish, so I close my office at 4 o'clock and I get home and I do Shabbat with my family, and I'm there focused on that when I'm at home. And for me, it's on a Friday night through Saturday. But different people, different ways. But that was his comment was if he does it 100%, it's much easier than doing it 99%. Because if he makes one exception, the championship game, he was talking about in his Rhodes Scholarship days when he was out there in Oxford, well, then it becomes easier the next time. And I thought to that for me, like, first of all, I'll be the first to share, I'm never 100% on anything. I try to be, I aspire to be, I desire to be, but I'm human. But what really struck me was that if I can keep myself there and I can keep myself from making, if I can keep myself from making that first excuse is just too expensive. Because if I make that one excuse, then it leads down to a whole series of other excuses that it becomes harder to hold the line later on. So I don't know what this looks like for you. For me, how it's impacted is, I put a hard stop in my working hours at 40 hours a week on average. Why? Because if I don't do that, I end up working 50, 60, 70 hours, and I've got young kids, and I want to be there, a presence in their lives. I make sure that I take 10 weeks of vacation every year. Now, you could say that, lucky you, but my point is sometimes it's difficult to take the time away. There are business reasons why it becomes difficult sometimes, and quite frankly, sometimes going away for another trip is not what I want to do. Sometimes staying home and enjoying the work that I do is what I want to do. But I push myself to do that because for me, if I stay consistent with that, number one, it's consistent with what I teach other clients, but number two, it pushes me to be a better dad, which for me is an incredibly important value, that I'm going to take time away from the business to be focused exclusively on my family and on raising my 3 sons and spending time with my wife, Heather. So I don't know what it is for you, but there are certain things in your life that if you let yourself make that first excuse and you choose the road of 99%, what happens is it leads down this slippery slope, and that's where you get the Ken Lays of the world. And 100% in certain things are really a much easier place to go. So don't make that first excuse. So these are the ideas that I took away. Again, I mentioned before, I read the book probably once every year, at least the summary notes that I have for it. Always there's something new and fresh. But for me, what would have to prove true in order for this strategy to work, and how will I measure and pay attention to that? And the theory of jobs, and the idea that 100% is easier than 99% in certain areas of my life. These are the things that have meaningfully helped me. And I would encourage you to get the book. It's just such a rich book with so many different ideas. I've primarily applied it in my business life, but especially for things like the 100% is easier than the 99%. Those are things that have dramatically impacted me on the personal front too.